Social relations. First, some big points about social relations. I like that they start this chapter off with the idea that people have complex social relationships. Complex. That's a huge point. We're complicated creatures. There's a lot of complexities out there, and our relationships are complicated. We have complex social relationships. I probably don't need to tell you this. Relationships are complicated, right? And I guess that one of the big points I want to make from this chapter is that when people are doing their social relationships and organizing themselves, and I'm not just talking about, the way we interact with others on a day-to-day basis and how complicated that may be, but in terms of how we organize our society. So we'll be talking about things like social class and caste, which we don't think we have in this country, but we kind of do. We'll be talking a little bit about gender, although we have a whole chapter coming up on gender later. Age, kinship, which is going to be a huge part of this chapter, marriage, and they don't talk about this much, but we should, friendship, just the relationships and bonds that people create with each other. And so when people are organizing their society, typically they're going to use a lot of these things simultaneously. And so what I guess I would say is be careful of anyone who says that society, any particular human society or people's lives in general can be reduced to only one. Ideas that, class is the biggest thing in life, or everything in life is determined by our gender, or who you are is determined by your family, and this society organizes themselves completely along the lines of kinship. And so people have made big statements, and they've looked at other societies and said, oh, well, this society, kinship is what matters completely and nothing else matters, when if they were looking at it just a slightly, if they'd taken a little bit more time, they'd see something like the importance of age sets or something like that. So we have to be careful, we have to be aware that humans are complicated, and we often use multiple ways of organizing ourselves, and some of these ways can come up and be foregrounded and then can fade away, but it doesn't mean it's gone away. And so related to that is the idea that humans again have complex, and this is a kind of a big word to use, but contingent histories, which is to say that the search for some sort of law or mechanism or absolute in human history is continually frustrated by the fact that humans are always doing things, and you can't find laws for the ways or rules for the ways that humans do things. So people have always looked at, let's go back to kinship, the idea that there's a biological basis for kinship, and that's all that matters, and then whatever we do culturally is simply an overlay on that underlying biology. Shown time and again to be a false conception. There's no universal way in which humans organize themselves. These things are a product of our history and our culture, and they could have been different, and they are always changing. Another big point about this is that a lot of anthropology studies differences in human relationships, so different ways in which people organize. And whenever we are talking about difference, we should also be aware that there might be the potential for hierarchy, putting people in different unequal places. And so we need to be aware of that. Now, it doesn't have to be that every time people say something, people are different from each other, there's an inherent inequality. So on page 122, there's a good example from the Andes on the idea of gender, which is to say that there are certain societies in which gender roles are seen as complementary. They're different, but they're seen as equally contributing. So in some societies, they may be quite different, people may be quite different, but they're seen as equal. So it's not true that every time you see difference, there's inequality, but you should always be aware of the potential for inequality every time you see difference. And a lot of times, inequalities are, people try to phrase inequalities as a cultural difference when the primary issue is one of power or inequality. And this happens in our own society all the time around issues, for example, of race, when people are trying to frame it as some sort of cultural difference, but the really underlying issue of that is a hierarchical inequality which has been set up. So we should always have that in our minds. It doesn't have to be there, but we should always, whenever we're talking about social differences, we have to think about power and inequality. So these are the sort of big points that I'd like to start with in the chapter before we get going into some of the different ways in which people organize themselves. Just trying to keep these kind of complexities in mind before we get into some of these particular ways in which people have organized themselves. So, speaking of difference and hierarchy, we get to the first page. Second page. Second page. The second page of this chapter is about social class. And all of a sudden, Matt, what is happening here? What goes on? All of a sudden, what are we talking about? What's the first thing you saw? How they separate those social classes. And what did you start talking about? What is the separation of social classes? We're talking about the middle class, you know, and how the middle.
Sometimes they separate people by their income or how much they own. Talk about democracies or the past, whereas capitalism was separating people into like classes. That means productions and people who don't have much production, so bourgeoisie.
Whoa, hey, now we're talking the freaking bourgeoisie and the proletariat and Karl Marx starting off this chapter. Whoa, now, you know, I mean, it's one thing to talk about social class, and I might be making a little more money than you, and I'm of the upper class, and you're of the middle class, and maybe somebody else considers it the working class. But holy God, bourgeoisie and proletariat, the people who own the means of production, and the people who have nothing to sell but their own labor power, the proletariat. That's some serious stuff. What is Marx doing here already? Let me put it to you this way. I don't think we could get away with this in the United States. If this textbook had been written in the United States, I don't think I could throw Marx in there so fast. What is Marx doing here? Why are we having Marx all of a sudden? Hard to know, right? It's very interesting to me that our textbook authors here start off what would in US anthropology be the kinship chapter. And we put Marx like at the very end, maybe. And when we're talking about something else like, you know, maybe capitalism, that would be something we'd hide at the very end because we're a little bit afraid of Marx in this country, perhaps more than that. They're plenty afraid of him in the UK too, but you know, we're just more nervous about bringing up Marx in school. So, you know, we might wonder, well, why are they bringing up Marx so fast before we talk about things like kinship? And, you know, they start talking about some things that were written. So one of the most famous books, it's not really a book. I'll talk about that in a second. One of the most famous things written by Marx and Friedrich Engels, who will come up in a second, so keep those names in mind, is of course called the Communist Manifesto, and that's where we get some of these famous phrases about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and that the proletariat have nothing to sell but their own labor. And, you know, I mean, I think that one reason that Marx is here, or it's good to have Marx here, is that he was some of the people who were most prominent in thinking about how people were organizing themselves and how things could be different from the past and could be different in the future. Now, Marx is very consumed with the idea of social class as kind of the moving principle of human history. But at the same time, there's at least this thinking which tends to think of humans as being at least in control of their own destiny, as opposed to thinking from before that time, which might have thought that the social relations were part of some kind of natural order or God-given order. And so we have some pretty heavy stuff from Marx and Engels here in the Communist Manifesto. I guess what I would actually like to, like I said, the Communist Manifesto is given to us as we read it sometimes in school as a book, but it was not really intended to be read as a book in school. When Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, there was an active revolutionary movement going on. And this was meant to inspire people who are on the barricades or inspire people to conduct a revolution. It's kind of like putting up posters or circulating memes. This is not them trying to analyze society. So we get a lot of people who read this and think this is what they were doing to analyze society. By the way, if you're trying to inspire people to do something or to be revolutionary, what are you likely to do in terms of your analysis of society? Yes, Sean.
I was going to say, to like inspire people, you use like propaganda and stuff.
Yeah, and propaganda is usually pretty simple stuff, right? You don't want to complexify it too much. You got to put it out there, right? And so this is them thinking that they're about to have a revolution. You want to get people on your side. You want your message to be as simple and as straightforward as possible. And so, you know, we have to keep that in mind whenever we're looking at this and thinking, oh, it's too simple. Yeah, it's too simple because, man, I'm trying to, you know, fire you up. I'm like the coach trying to say, hey. And the other thing is, if people are in a revolution, what do you want them to feel like will happen at the end of that thing? Yeah, go ahead, John.
Like victory.
Yeah, I mean, you're like, we're gonna win this thing, guys, right? It was mostly guys. We're gonna win. And so, you know, Marx and Engels wrote that the communist revolution was going to be inevitable, that it couldn't fail. Well, you know, that's a great message. If you're on the revolutionary lines, you want to know that you're going to win. You don't want to know that you're going to lose, right? So what I'm getting to is that if you read some other stuff by Marx, some later stuff, it's actually much more reflective and analytical and less about, you know, Marx is criticized for saying that the revolution was inevitable. So later on, about, you know, years after this, when the revolution didn't work out the way he was thinking it was going to work out, there's another essay, which is more like a book, called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is about the rise of Napoleon, one of Napoleon's nephews in France. And so what Marx was trying to figure out is, look, we had this revolutionary moment, and somehow we got this sort of reactionary person who becomes, you know, basically the dictator of France, and people seem to vote for that and to like it. How was it that we went from being on the barricades to being in this situation? And so in this work, he's actually much more reflective on different kinds of social class, the ways that things can be strange in history and go wrong. But back in the day, it was much. It was a different person between the time of trying to sit on the barricades and do the revolution thing. So if you want to critique Marx's analysis of society, try the 18th Brumaire. The Communist Manifesto is fun to read if you're about to do the revolution thing. So I mentioned that we should keep in mind that Friedrich Engels was going to be in there. Engels and Marx were buddies. They wrote the Communist Manifesto together, wrote some stuff together and then some stuff apart. And this book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, is Friedrich Engels, again, later on in life, being reflective on things like kinship. And interestingly, and they mentioned this here a couple times in the book, is that Engels in this book that he wrote, they mentioned this on the textbook on page 132, and they mentioned Lewis Henry Morgan on page 125. Interestingly, Engels was drawing upon the anthropological work of Lewis Henry Morgan. And so in his ideas about how capitalism and private property had come about, Engels was kind of fascinated with what Lewis Henry Morgan had said about the Iroquois in the Americas, which is kind of interesting for a number of reasons. To us, well, for one thing, Lewis Henry Morgan he's like kind of, for us New Yorkers, upstate New Yorkers, he's kind of like our anthropologist. So we sometimes hear about, and we will hear a lot about, Franz Boas, who was a German Jewish immigrant to the United States, basically set up the academic wing of anthropology after, and was in many ways against some of the ideas that Lewis Henry Morgan had. Lewis Henry Morgan was really not trained as an anthropologist, but he was very interested in social life, and so he did something like what we might consider field work among the Iroquois and talked about different societies. But what Lewis Henry Morgan signals in a lot of ways, and he's kind of very into, in the Syracuse, New York, that area of the world region is seen as kind of a founder of anthropology there. But what Lewis Henry Morgan was saying here is reflective of a turn in anthropology towards the idea of understanding human kinship. And what Morgan and others believed is that, the biological need for sexual reproduction was obviously a human universal. And so we could know what, kinship was supposed to be based on these kind of universal biological relationships. And we could then talk about different evolutionary stages of human life, again, based on their ideas about kinship reckonings. And so people had a number of very strange ideas about marriage and kinship based on this, but the idea was that human society was fundamentally based on this idea of kinship. And if we could just discover those relationships and understand how people organize themselves as the human family, systems of consanguinity, I think I'm pronouncing that correct, we would say that means, sort of like blood relations, and affinity, that again means like marriage or being connected in different ways other than blood, of the human family, right? And so again, the idea is that kinship here is central to human life. Like I said, Engels, who's a buddy of Marx, draws upon this for his own ideas of social evolution. And so what anthropologists did is they would go into different places and they would construct these charts of relatedness via what we call blood or biological descent. and via marriage. And so you may have seen this kind of thing. Sometimes these things have become a little bit popular in people who do genealogies and those kinds of things because you know, people want to figure out who their relatives are and where they're descended from. And so you may have seen these kinds of charts around, but anthropologists in some ways invented this idea of the kinship chart. And it was also useful because they would give these kinds of things, they'd give these interview schedules to, let's say, soldiers or missionaries or travelers. And they would say, okay, well, when you're off in such and such a place, talk to the people there and ask them, who is their, what do they call their father? What do they call their mother? What do they call their father's brother? And so then they collect these things and try to organize them and try to figure out different ways in which people did their kinship. So actually I want to try and see if we can just do this for ourselves. And so, you know, we're going to start with ego. Ego is another word for I, or in this case, you. And then you're going to kind of go sideways and back. I'll actually show you a little, a short video of someone who did a very nice job of this, I think, for Intro to Anthropology. And as she's doing it, hopefully, it'll help us along the way. Let's see. How are we doing? How's the kinship going? Not so well? You don't even know most of your kin. Yeah, I love that person. I think she's so nice. But I feel like there's a few things that are missing from that presentation, or maybe added in that don't need to be there. What do you think? What do you think of that in today's world? Yeah.
Like the whole divorce and marriage is kind of
The whole divorce and marriage, yeah. People made a big deal out of that, as you can see. They'd have like the double lines and then the line through, and if it wasn't a marriage, it would just be a single line. And it's like, for one thing, you know, the kinship chart, you might see, does not handle that very well. Things start going off in different directions, and then you can't keep everything on the same line. So yeah, there was a, you know, the kinship charts were organized around this obsession with the idea that everybody was going to look kind of the same all throughout. And, you know, people didn't, although oftentimes they just told the anthropologists that they were. I don't know if this has happened in your own families, but, you know, like things that happened that were complicated just kind of get smoothed over and like, oh yeah, and then it just, for outside consumption, like say if an anthropologist asked you what happened, you're like, oh yeah, well, those are my cousins. And you know, you don't know that they were from 3 different people, because why do you need to know? Too much information, right? So people would sort of smooth things out over time, which is fine. What else is kind of missing, or what is different about today's society that we might want to, you know, be aware of when we're doing these charts? Yeah, team. Same-sex marriage. Yeah, I mean, you know, like things that was a very heteronormative presentation. And it was a very kin-heavy presentation, right? That poor uncle over there is like, yep, there he was. He never married. He never had kids. He's got nobody. It's like, what? You know, come on, people. Same-sex marriage, and what else? Yes, Aaron. Yeah, there was very very girl-boy heavy there, right? Including calling herself a girl, which I guess you're allowed to do. But you know, there wasn't any room for anything else to go on. So you know, fortunately, we have the square. You can always use the square, but that I guess leads to different ideas. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that is kind of funny about today's world. If you got into this, or I mean, if you did your kinship chart a little bit, she asks you to start what she calls it in landscape mode, like this. Why do we start our charts in landscape mode? Or why do we start them in wide? Why is that important when you're trying to do this? Yeah, Leah.
Because the way that this grows is kind of outward and not like really all that out.
Because it's kind of outward and really not all that up, right? And this actually is important because it talks to us about the way we do kinship in our society, which is something that our textbook doesn't tell us because I guess they just assume we all know this. We have what we call a bilateral kinship system, which is to say that we believe that we are equally related to the people on both sides of our parents, whoever they may be, and that equal relationship sort of extends up and back. And so the further generations you go back, it's going to get wider and wider, right? Because technically you should have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8, 60, you know, it keeps going back. And most people in bilateral kinship systems, can anybody name their, let's see, can anybody name, yeah, let's pretend we're in a matrilineal society. Mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother. Does anybody know who that is? 5 generations back. Not off the top of your head. Anybody know 4? Some people know 4. When you're young, you might know 4. Most people can go to like 3 in a bilateral system because it's lots of people and so it expands out that way. So, but that's not the only way that we can organize our kinship. A lot of the world has organized itself in terms of patrilineal kinship, in which you are considered to be in some ways more related. And if this gets into an extreme situation, some people might not even consider themselves to be as related to the people who are on their mother's side. So a patrilineal system hands things down in terms of inheritance through the father's line. And if you're in a pretty serious patrilineal society, you would probably want to start your kinship chart in portrait mode, because it would be most important for you to sort of do that lineage back. And you wouldn't have to worry about those branches off on your mother's side and your grandmother's side, because you could probably name 5 or 6 generations back. And the other, because it doesn't get so wide and complicated. Now that's not to say that people in patrilineal societies don't consider themselves related to, like I said, that would be kind of an extreme of a patrilineal society. We do have, so we do basically a bilateral system, but we do have some patrilineal stuff going on. Aaron, what's our patrilineal stuff that we have going on in a lot of cases?
Most of like people's inheritance, or even when somebody's married, like traditionally take the man's last name, that's starting to change now.
It's starting to change now. Let's talk about the last name part. That is starting to change, but probably not as much as it's not as changing as much as I thought it would be changing back in the day. My children have my last name. My wife did not take my last name, and I thought nobody would do that anymore. But people are still doing that. There are some hyphenated kids running around these days. but not as many as I thought there would be, I guess. And I don't know. I mean, like I said, I think the naming thing is changing, but we definitely do a lot of naming stuff patrilineally. Inheritance, I think, I don't know. What do you think about inheritance? I thought that did change. Am I wrong? That people divided up with like their kids, girls and boys. I think that's basically happened. But, you know, I mean, I would just say that European societies were very late to legalize inheritance and property ownership for women. And so, you know, oftentimes we get into these, you know, some people think about Islamic society as being non-friendly to women, but in terms of property inheritance, they were hundreds of years ahead of most European and American societies in terms of ownership of land and property in terms of women. So, you know, the inheritance thing is probably changed a bit. So this brings up a different or another point here, which is that, you know, oftentimes a patrilineal society is also going to be what we might call patriarchal. It's going to be focused on male ownership of stuff, male ownership of land, male ownership of people. It doesn't have to be, right? But oftentimes when you have a patrilineal society, it's also patriarchal. Now, we can also organize, and this has been important in many societies, although probably less common, but many societies, we could have a matrilineal system, which means that inheritance, names, all that stuff, that good stuff goes through the line of the women, the mothers, grandmothers, and that people would consider themselves more related to their mother's side than they would to their father's side. And one of the things that people wanted to believe or thought was true for a while is that such societies would be kind of a mirror image of patriarchal societies, that they'd be matriarchal societies. And as our book tells us, women usually in matrilineal societies will have important ceremonial positions. They may have power, there may be more equal power sharing, but we've never found a sort of matriarchal society that is female dominated in the way that we have found of patriarchal societies. I'm not going to say that it's impossible, but it just hasn't been found. And so, you know, matrilineal societies, different kinds of people become important. For example, in a kid's life, in a matrilineal society, the mother's brother is often going to be the most important for a child's development and inheritance and all those things, because that's where the inheritance line is going to be coming in. And you might look at your own kinship chart. Some people say that even in our society, we don't have separate terms for uncle on the father's side and uncle on the mother's side. Many societies have a different term for uncle if it's your father's side or your mother's side. Obviously, because if you're in a patrilineal or matrilineal society, that relationship is going to be very different. Some people say that in our own society, or you know, some societies, that there are these kinds of, because women in our society often run the kinship, you might say, and do all the birthday parties and stuff, that people end up being closer to people on their mother's side, and the mother's brother still does retain this kind of importance. Of course, not everybody has brothers and sisters on their parents' side, but you might kind of look at that relationship and see if it works, see if it's of interest to you. So, as I said, anthropology got really into this because it seemed like, wow, you could unlock so many keys of society, and you know, this was the way that people organized themselves, especially when it was believed that people didn't have, you know, sort of other governing institutions like the state. And so in the old days, about 50, 60 years ago, if you'd come into this class in the 1950s, especially in the UK, people made a joke that anthropology had become kinshipology. And we would spend all our time looking at kinship charts. That would be the first chapter of things. And we'd talk about things like, you know, there we go, like the matrilateral parallel cousins. So matrilateral parallel cousins to me are going to be the cousins that are on my mother's sister's side. And then they have the matrilateral cross cousins who would be the mother's brothers, you know, so things got, and we'd just be doing these kinds of things, and we'd be talking about all these different ways in which people organize their kinship and the terms they'd use. And, you know, I guess it was fun. I mean, there's something fun about that, right? If you're really into that stuff. Your textbook mentions on page 126 the work of Radcliffe Brown, who wrote a book called Structure and Function in Primitive Society, which is all about this idea of what he called structural functionalism, or what was called structural functionalism, which often was about how kinship and other institutions all kind of fit together in these structures that function in these different societies. And, you know, I mean, in some ways, this was, it was quite interesting stuff because, you know, nobody had sort of cataloged the rest of all the world in these ways. And you could unlock all these funny different things about people that seemed to be very explanatory about their lives. So one of his most famous articles was this really interesting article. There was a group of people that anthropologists had looked at, and they were, how to say, different people like to talk about sex more than others. And some people are more culturally prudish. Some people are more crude, and some people are more prude. Let's put it that way. So in this society, there was this group of people who were pretty not talking about sex. Everything was very buttoned down. You didn't make jokes. You didn't do this thing. Sex talk was kind of off the table. No sex jokes. Except the anthropologists noticed that when a young man was around one particular older woman, all of a sudden between them, there would be a ton of like sex jokes and talk and like, you know, pulling at each other and goofing around, and everybody would be making fun of them. But then when they would go away, it wasn't like this, then it would just go back to being normal talk again. It was only between one, you know, or, you know, in other houses they'd go to, it'd be between one young man and one older woman that'd have this joking relationship, and then that was it. And then nothing ever came of it, but it was just a lot of sex. Who do you think, what might be the relationship between that man and that woman? What would explain such a thing? Well, look on your own kinship charts. What is the classic stereotypical source of tension in our society between, how to say, the people in our parents' generation and the people in our grandparents' generation? Huh? The mother-in-law. Yeah. And that's what Radcliffe Brown said about this society, that there was a very tense relationship between the mother-in-law and the son-in-law. And so this joking stuff helped to diffuse the tension. And so, you know, you look at this and it wouldn't make sense otherwise, but once you know that about their kinship system and the source of tension, you're like, aha, there it is. It explains society. So again, anthropology got way into that. we would say, you know, we'd use all these funny terms, cross cousins and matrilineals and uxorolocal, which I didn't even know was a term, but it is a term. It actually just means what we'd call matrilocal. But anyway, in the old days, you'd have to learn all this stuff. And there was a sense that anthropology, you know, we've kind of always had science envy. So, you know, if we put up all these weird words and put up all these charts, we'd look more like chemistry. And so, you know, there was this time that that's what anthropology seemed headed to. But then basically kinship began, as your textbook says, it began to fade out of anthropology as a main concern. And so what happened was, or I think people started thinking about this a little bit differently. On the one hand, people started to realize that kinship perhaps was more of an obsession of the Brits, of the Europeans, of the US, an obsession under this kind of colonial relationship that the people themselves may not have been into as much as the anthropologists were. And, you know, if you've ever been around people with their, you know, old, like, you know, Europeans with their family crests and family trees and castles and stuff, you know, they're the ones who seem super obsessed about descent and marrying the right person and kinship than sometimes the people themselves. So some anthropologists from other places were like, this isn't even a thing that people are as into in our society. The other thing is that many of these studies, perhaps the most famous study that argued that of the importance of kinship and lineage and descent was a study by Evans Pritchard of the New Era, who were at the time engaged in a kind of, you might call it an anti-colonial war. They were being colonized by the Brits, but they were fighting them off. And so let me put it to you this way. If you're in a war, who can you trust? Yeah, Sean.
Your allies.
Your allies. You can trust your allies, but let's say, you know, things are getting tough out there. Who am I going to most depend upon? Who can I turn to and know they're not going to betray me? Your family, yeah. So kinship and family get heightened in these times of crisis and tension, right? I'm kind of feeling it now, right? They're the people we can turn to and trust. And so there's also this idea that a lot of this stuff got heightened up during the colonial period, both because the colonizers were kind of obsessed also with coming into a place and being like, who's your chief? Who's your leader? Who's in charge here? And they'd be like, well, you know, this person is our, you know, is our person in charge. And then that might have been a temporary role, but the colonizers wanted something fixed down. And so, you know, it got ginned up both from the European side, and it got perhaps amplified if you're trying to, you know, fight somebody off and you're trying to call on those kinds of relationships in order to support you. So, you know, as life is changing, and this was also one of the issues of structural functionalism, if everything in a society is structured and functioning together, then how does it change? How do things change? Why would they ever change? And so it's sort of, the ideas kind of started to fall apart during this time as people were changing their societies in terms of the colonial experience and gaining independence. There was also the issue of all these, you know, the ideas of having kinship rules and, you know, so-and-so shall only marry so-and-so, and the actual lived experience of kinship. And so, you know, oftentimes the people would state these rules, but the rules are sort of more like guidelines. And if you look a little bit closer, people are, you know, constructing these things in different ways. And this was often related to the idea that many anthropologists would be talking to the kind of elderly man in the society, and they'd be doing the interviews. And, you know, sometimes those of you who know how elderly men can be, you get these kind of very formalized explanations for how things are supposed to be, how they should work, how things how things might, again, a tendency to maybe smooth over some of the complexities. And then there's so many reasons that kinship broke down. The idea that, in many societies, what anthropologists started to call fictive kinship were actually as important as what we get really into this term of blood, but other people don't even think of it as blood and marriage. Willa, what is fictive kinship?
It's like kinship is based on other ties besides, as we see, blood and marriage. They are.
Yeah, and so, I mean, we can talk about all kinds of things that people start considering themselves to be like kin and different forms of friendship. A lot of societies base their kinship more on practices of feeding and food and caregiving. So it doesn't matter so much if you're, biologically descended from someone. It matters more who is feeding each other. And so, I mean, again, there's, as your textbook explains, this whole terminology of fictive kinship is actually a little bit insulting in some ways, because it assumes there's some other thing called real kinship, and that the things that we do in life is not as important as that. And in many societies, in fact, in part including our own, kinship is done through the actions that we take, and the things like, again, like feeding, which is also a biological thing. When we feed other people, we grow and change biologically. And actually, I was in a class, you may have heard the expression, blood is thicker than water. Ever heard that? Yeah, so actually the student explained to me, and I looked it up, and that expression is actually a misquote, or not it's only a part of a longer passage, which actually says that the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. And so actually, in the full context, what it's saying is that your relationship with, I guess, Jesus in this case, is more important than the sort of what you might call the less important relationship of your own family. And so, it's weird that this phrase has become basically an idea that family is more important than friends, when actually the original was claiming that our activities in the world were more important than even the water of the womb. That's what. All right. So kinship fades out. Then our chapter goes into the idea of marriage, and starts us off with the important point that when we think about people getting married, that it often has a lot to do, as we saw in kinship, with inheritance, how things are going to be passed down. If someone has a legal right, or is able to have a claim to inheritance, with being able to make alliances with different groups, political alliances, or just keeping resources in the family. And Jalen would say, what would you say, Jalen? What's missing? Huh? Love. What about love? Right? Because we're supposed to be married for love. Now, what about love? I guess I will say this. First of all, I want to be clear that, almost everywhere in human life, everywhere that I've seen, and throughout history and across different societies, people acknowledge something like love, like, I don't know, attraction between two individuals, or care over time for two individuals. So there's different, obviously, even in our own society, we have a tough time figuring out what love is. But something like that, like romantic love, seems to be present in almost every society. But the idea that you should base your marriage choice on love and romantic love is pretty recent in human history. It comes up about a couple hundred years ago, maybe maybe even only 100 years ago, and emerges from certain social situations. So in most societies, they would say that, well, sure, love is good, but it's way too fragile for us to be basing a marriage on. And you know, you might think about your own relationships and how many times, like, you'll be in love, and then you're either in love with someone or they're, you know, then all of a sudden they fall in love with somebody else. It's like, whoa, hey, how did that happen so fast? So, you know, people would say, okay, so one version of this would be, well, you can grow into love in your marriage. If you have a good match, you're going to grow up and develop this love over time. We just don't want to put it as the basis for our marriage. But Jalen, you said the Masai were sort of even more extreme about this. They didn't even want them to get in love at all, right? Why not? Yeah, it was pretty businessy. And you know, you don't want to mix too much love and business, too fickle. So I guess I would say that's probably an extreme, that they were kind of not into that at all. In most societies that have this, then you're kind of in some ways allowed or permitted to do some stuff that's not part of the business of being married. Now, around the world, people have also, in many different societies, because of media consumption, because of this idea of being in a modern world or a modern relationship, a lot of people all over the world now think, yes, you know, I should have what we call companionate marriage, that my marriage should be based on love. I put had been on the rise because in some ways we're also hearing from some societies that there are people who are disappointed with the results of romantic love and are kind of thinking about, you know what, that setting up matches was not such a terrible idea. Maybe, Mom, you could set me up with somebody who you know is a stable person, and we'll then, you know, get to love each other after that. So I think it's probably, love is probably still on the rise as a thing that people want, but some people are kind of, you know, wary of love via Tinder, you might say. All right, marriage and our good old-fashioned monogamy. Michelle, what is monogamy?
It refers to a relationship which person is married to one partner.
One partner at a time. Oh yes, right. I forgot about the idea of serial monogamy, which is having one person after another, which is somewhat present in our society. But yeah, monogamy, you're only supposed to be married for one person at a time. Our chapter talks about issues of, you know, whether there are payments to the bride or payments from the groom, and these are known as dowry and bride wealth. Again, reflecting that in some ways marriage has a lot to do with those social relationships, economic relationships, inheritance relationships. And then also talks about where people live, so that they will either be matrilocal, where you go to live with your wife's family, or patrilocal, where you go to live with your father's family, which often but not always correspond to matrilineal and patrilineal societies. Wait, what do we do? Yeah, somebody said, hey, let's get married. I'm gonna go live with my mom. Probably not the thing. We have what is called our ideal is a neo-local idea, which is that if you get married, you're supposed to have your own new house that is not part of your parents' house on either side. So yes, or we do neither of these. Our ideal is having a neo-local house. You may have noticed, though, that marriage rates in the United States have dropped quite a bit, and especially among working class people, because it's so hard to have a neo-local new house relationship. And so it's become difficult to acquire the resources to get married. And, you know, what's also striking to me in this is that in traditional anthropology textbooks, and I probably did this in Intro to Anthropology for many of you, once we start talking about monogamy, then we start talking about polygamy, and then we talk about polygyny, which is a man being married to more than one wife, and then we talk about polyandry, which is a woman being married to more than one husband. And they don't really talk about polygamy here. And I think one of the reasons they don't is because around the world, it's actually very difficult to be in a polygamous relationship anymore. Because in most societies that permitted polygamous relationships, you had to have separate houses for each, if it's polygyny, for each wife. So it's only a very small, tiny portion of the wealthiest in society who might be able to do this thing. So, you know, I'm not saying that like those relationships have entirely gone away, but they're very expensive to try and carry out. And so I think that most marriages in the world today are based on a form of at least temporary monogamy. So getting married, where you're going to live, and then they discuss something that's always been of interest to anthropologists, which is the incest taboo. And so basically the incest taboo is present in all societies, which is you can't get married to somebody who is too close to you. And so I don't think there's, who can't you get married to here? Well, actually, in at least 26 states, you can marry those people on either side known as your first cousins. But so who can't you get married to? Huh? Yeah. Oh, well, see, we would consider all of these people to be equally first cousins, right? They're either children of our parents' siblings. So they would be equally in our society first cousins. The people you can't get married to here are right, sister, not a legal marriage candidate there. So you know, in almost every society, I think the siblings are off the table, except among certain royal groups in which they could come into the table because in part they were part of the divine. And so, you know, the divine, if you're in the divine, you can break the incest taboo. But you know, this would be considered way too close. Like I said, in most, even in our own society, you can get married to your first cousin. In matrilineal or patrilineal societies, if you don't consider yourself technically to be related to, say, let's say I'm in a patrilineal society, I'm not actually going to consider myself to be related to, especially my matrilateral cross cousins. They would be considered to be kind of far away, but close enough. And so they might be considered a good candidate for marriage here is, you know, again, we would consider that to be first cousins, but in a society that did patrilineal or matrilineal reckonings of relatedness, they would be considered not related in this, suitable for marriage. I don't want to be icky here. Your textbook does mention, and it's true, that genetically speaking, whenever you have a child with anybody, because humans are basically genetically all the same, your risk for genetic defects is about, I don't know, 2%, let's say. And that if you do a cousin relationship, your risk goes up to about 2.6%, which is not that much different. And the geneticists now say there's actually no reason to necessarily prohibit that or do a special test or anything, unless you have genetic diseases that are already running in your family. So the idea that the incest taboo comes to us from biology or from genetics simply doesn't seem to hold. And I guess, although I don't really want to think about it, that even her textbook states that even sister-brother relationships that produce children, their chances of there being genetic defect go up to only like 9 or 10%, which is a lot more, of course, than 2%, but it's not, that means 90% of them you're not gonna see anything genetically different anyway. The incest taboo doesn't seem to be biologically relevant, but it does relate to this other idea that we all have in all societies of who you can marry within the group and who you have to marry, or how far within your group you can marry and how far outside of the group you can marry. So this is known as endogamy, which means marriage within a group, and exogamy, which means marriage outside a group. And so we all in our society have sort of both formal, sometimes there are very formal rules about who you're supposed to marry, and a lot of times there are also informal ideas about who you're supposed to marry. And even if there's a formal rule, it's going to be reinforced by the informal as well. So actually, Timur, you were talking about caste, but you related it to the Kazakhs and different kinds of ideas, which sounded to me kind of like endogamy and exogamy. Who are you supposed to marry there? Or who can you and can't you marry?
There are 3 levels of the caste. You can marry maximum caste, low caste, and low caste, but you cannot go below caste.
So you can go one above, but not below.
Above is it's like it's positive from above.
Oh yeah, you want to do that if you're from the below, right? Yeah. Yeah, you want to marry up. Good. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, and often like I said, sometimes this has a more formal attribute, like, okay, the people in this group want to marry these people, and there's rules about it. But again, it's often reinforced by informal ideas about who belongs with whom. And so I think we talked about this already in this class, is, in our world, in the United States, we do love all the time, but we also have very strong social class endogamy. Very rare to see people marry outside of their class. And so how do we do that? We talked about this already, so I'll be very brief. How do we let people fall in love with whoever they want to, while somehow they always seem to fall in love with people from their own social class? So one way we do it is just by the place you live and the people you're around, and the amount your house costs is often pretty much correlated to what your social class or your wealth is going to be. And the other good way to do it is college, because that's where you get all the people who had basically the same scores on their standardized tests and bring them together, and the standardized tests are correlated to wealth. And so, hey, you meet people from the same social class when all those romantic hormones are firing away, and you got some free time, you get some parties, and then you get people eventually hooking up into serial monogamous relationships. So again, in many societies, there's a formal code, an idea about, okay, you shouldn't or can't marry someone of this way. But in all societies, there's going to be these informal ideas or ways in which they're reinforced about who you're able to marry and who you're not able to marry.